Hello, good morning. Welcome to part two of our discussion with Professor Gregory Connell. So we ended the previous discussion by talking about intelligence and admixture studies, linkage, disequilibrium, etc. Now we're starting part two. Gregory, what do you mean by DNA cluster analysis? How are these admixture studies conducted?
Okay, that's a good question. So, this is interestingly, just like the G factor, this is basically a factor analytic statistical method. Remember the cards, we took a deck of cards and we didn't shuffle it properly. We just cut it. And this is what's done with the DNA, which means that you have very long common strands that you share with even seventh order cousins. So all your broad family, which in my case, for instance, is what they call Irish, but of course that involves a whole range of different European-based groups. Okay, so I have all these seventh order cousins scattered around the British Isles and in parts of France, etc. They will share long blocks of DNA with me. Okay, so and they'll be common. We'll be able to identify that commonality. Remember, we're working with this 2.9 billion long string of digits, 0, 1, 2 digits. So we have this long string of digits. So then what we can do then is we can sort people into common groups. Okay, so we could sort them into 2 common groups or 3 common groups or 4. That's called the number of factors in factor analysis. And here it's called the number of clusters. So we choose some number of groups which we think are an appropriate number, often based on geographic barriers. So for instance, we'd say, oh, look at Africa. Africa has a big impenetrable desert at the top of sub-Saharan Africa, as it's called. Okay, and from there, it's a contiguous body of land surrounded by large oceans. So that would be the perfect range where people tend to be related to one another. So they'll have common ancestry in that group. And then we'd say, okay, what about East Asia? East Asia has the Himalayan mountains blocking it on one side, and the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans blocking it on the other side, with a tiny strip of land that doesn't cross anymore up in Siberia, connecting it to North America. So it's a block of land which is contiguous. It's people can travel around it, but separated from the European by called the Eurasian area by the Himalayas. Okay, so there's kind of a blocked body of land there, as well as, of course, the New World is its own block of land. So we separate our clusters according to basically geography, continental level geography. And then we basically allow a statistical package to take all the samples in our data, which are individuals, and divide up their particular genome according to what proportion of their ancestry comes from these clusters. That's basically the underlying procedure. Now, it's obviously very sophisticated and clever in how it does this nowadays, but that's what you're basically doing. You're clustering sample genomes into categories, including proportional categories. So someone might be 50% East Asian and 50% Amerindian, meaning Indian, as it's called, American Indian. Or they might be 20% African, 20% European, and 60% East Asian. So we statistically divide up an individual's ancestry into clusters. That's called cluster analysis. Of course, that's the key technical trick that allowed admixture regression to begin. It was only with the solving of the human genome. It was only after we had identified each of the 2.9 billion base pairs that we're able to properly do this methodology. So it's all 21st century, because the Human Genome Project was only completed really in 2003. So after that, we can do this. And it's amazing how, how good it is. It's amazing. It finds the work now is so sophisticated that they can identify ancestry groups that no longer exist. They can say there used to be an ancestry group in Europe that no longer exists, but we can still see shadows of it in people's, they call them ghost populations. A ghost population is a population which has no current members, but there's still shadows of it in the statistics of the genome. So you can still see it in databases of genomic samples. So that's a key underlying step in admixture regression. Now, I'm not a geneticist, so for me doing admixture regression studies, I'm pretty far from that, okay, in terms of my knowledge base. But I'm basically taking that information and then using it to do these regression, this regression analysis. So you're kind of given in some sense, or my co-authors are a little closer to that work. You choose the number of clusters, and then it gives you admixture proportions for each individual in your database.
And your conclusion, according to the study, genetic ancestry and the general cognitive ability in a sample of American youths, if that G is positively predicted by admixture.
Yes, you can see that the admixture has an impact. Rather, not the admixture itself, but the proportions of admixture has an impact on G factor scores. So East Asians so if you have more East Asian ancestry, you tend to do better on typical G factor scoring metrics. And if you have European ancestry, you're not doing quite as well, but your proportion of European ancestry tends to also positively predict relative to the average. African ancestry, unfortunately, underpredicts relative to the average. So the higher percentage of African ancestry statistically correlates with lower average G factor scores. Of course, these are just distributional features. We're not identifying base pairs, as I've said. We're just getting this broad tendency that's in this group of seventh order cousins, but that's the feature of the data.
Amerindian ancestry is also negatively associated with G.
Yes, and Amerindian ancestry also, surprisingly, because they're closest to the best performing, which is the East Asian ancestry, but they also negatively perform relative to the average, the US average. Of course, they have a terrible environment as well, at least in the US. The true Native American communities are quite deprived. They're particularly deprived, the Indian reservations in the US. So you can see how there'd be a substantial environmental component, but there's also, an identifiable genetic component to their test score underperformance. Yes.
According to Terry Anderson, another economist, Native Americans need economic freedom. There is a strange arrangement between the federal government and Native Americans, which limits their ability to perform economically. But other than that specific issue, this conclusion is consistent with Lynn's recent findings showing that other indigenous groups tend to be fast life history strategists and they have lower IQs on average. So again, it could also be genetic.
Yeah, it could be genetic, though I have to agree with him. Sometimes a coddling approach to groups can be counterproductive. And I think there might be some truth to that in the case of Native Americans, because obviously the American government feels a lot of guilt, as they should, for the historical treatment of this group. And kind of maybe in the modern day, that is counterproductive, that maybe what they need is a more, a less coddling approach, that they need to be able to develop entrepreneurship. I know you've talked about entrepreneurship in your recent article. They
Yes.
need to be able to develop entrepreneurship and on their own, and use that as a way to, break some of the poor performance they've had. But yes, the bad news, and I know I'm a bearer of bad news with these admixture regression results. They clearly are,
No, no,
disappointing
no.
findings. There
I
isn't.
like I like Arthur Jensen and Donald Templer and Richard Lynn, but I keep referring to Richard Lynn because the funny thing about Richard Lynn's research is that his research is consistent with the historical literature on personality differences. So my training is in history and international relations. And when you read primary sources and academic books, these writers are politely telling us that Africans were lower in long-term orientation. So
Yes.
Richard Lynn's findings confirm what historians are saying politely.
Yes. Yes. I think that's very interesting. And I think it's interesting also that the blank slate, kind of this blank slate approach, that we're all identical. There's no statistical differences between anyone or any group, that everyone's identical except for their upbringing. Which developed really in the 1920s, as I said, and kind of dominated the discourse for a century, okay? Because we're a century later, and it still dominates the discourse. But I think the Human Genome Project has really blown that out of the water. It's just destroyed it. It was already looking a little bit, tattered after the twin study work. And people were starting to say, gee, this blank slate theology, almost, that orthodoxy that we've all absorbed, that developed in the 1920s and dominated social sciences for the later part of the 20th century, and kind of has now drifted into the 21st century. It's really, the Human Genome Project has just, in my opinion, destroyed it. It's just
Demolished
not
it. I
credible
agree.
anymore. Yeah. And if you look at your historians, you're talking about historians. If you go back to the 1920s, and as an economist, I think of Keynes, for example. Keynes, by modern, 2024 terminology, was a racist, but he's a really nice guy. He said, okay, there are these tendencies, the Irish are hard drinking people. Okay, for example, just to bring in my own background. And it turns out there's probably some truth to that. But that nowadays would be considered unthinkable. Or the idea that the Jewish community is kind of very thrifty and good businessmen. Now that Keynes would have not batted an eyelash at that. Or if they said to him, the African people tend to be very gregarious and but not entrepreneurial, as you've said in your paper. He wouldn't have batted an eyelash. And then that became unthinkable with the blank slate orthodoxy. Such a thought would be unthinkable for a modern economist. But I think probably with the Human Genome Project, we're going to realize that those guys way back in the 1910s, there was truth to what they were saying. And you mentioned the historians. I haven't read as much history as you have, but from my reading, I'd say the same. You can be a very decent person and realize there's these broad statistical tendencies which are observable at the historical or continental level, which mean nothing to the individual. They're not important at the individual level, but when we look at broad statistical features, we observe these tendencies. And I think that's something, that's a shock to the system that we have to absorb. And I think it's just coming out of it's coming out of the scientific findings. And I think we're going to go back to the pre-blank slate world a little bit. At least there'll be some movement back to that in the way scientists think about human diversity. I believe there might be. It's certainly
Exactly.
time for it.
So for example, the primary sources on Caribbean history assert that Africans have a proclivity for entertainment. They like to dance. Contemporary literature suggests that people of African descent, their rhythmic ability is greater.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
again, the literature is consistent. It was not just a stereotype. Some stereotypes are untrue, but according to stereotype
Yes.
accuracy literature, stereotypes on average are true.
Yes. Yes. And we just don't know how to absorb that and deal with it because we don't want to go back we don't want to go back to 1900. But at the same time, we know that the blank slate model is now scientifically a failure. It doesn't
Yes,
fit the
it's
data.
untenable.
So we need to find, and this is why I think, a lot of people, I know you've talked to Nathan Kofnas, and I have to say I agree with him about this, though I don't have his philosophical expertise. But I do think we need to find a new equilibrium, a new scientific philosophy. The blank slate philosophy is just not credible. And if you try to publish a paper about admixture regression using G-factor scores, it's okay if you use sleep depth or diabetes, but if you try to do an admixture regression study using G-factor scores, you come against this brick wall. The psychology journals have decided we will not allow this. This approach is censored. It will not be admitted in our journals. And it's quite poisonous and vicious in many cases, but there's this brick wall, okay? And I just think as a social scientist, you can't allow that to happen. There has to be the ability to exchange ideas and be open with new ideas. So something has to change. Something, because the information still drips out, and it doesn't drip out in probably the best form if it's not allowed to get right into the community of scientific ideas and be discussed. So I do think that we need to change our paradigm in some way to absorb the Human Genome Project and its findings, that diversity is not just at the cultural level, diversity is also at the genetic level. That's a very difficult thing to say, to the social science research community. The idea that diversity is also at the genetic level, not only at the cultural level. It's simply that's not a permitted idea in kind of the mainstream scientific community.
Exactly. And that's why such views are curtailing the growth of innovative science. So, for example, I would prefer to read more studies on the genetics of non-cognitive traits. Non-cognitive traits facilitate cognitive and professional performance. There are
Yes,
two prominent studies concurring that African Americans score lower on measures of non-cognitive performance. So that's
sure.
really
Yes, I agree
important.
with you. Yeah,
There's a
that's
Todd Early
interesting. And you
study and
mentioned,
there is another study. And you and their co-author also wrote a paper, linear and partially linear models of behavioral trait variation using admixture regression. It's quite complicated. So just tell us the essence. You don't have to elaborate.
okay,
What's the essence of this
okay,
paper?
yeah. I've kind of covered a lot of that, Lipton, in a way that really was as you say, a complicated statistical a treatment of the admixture regression paradigm, the general approach, and its assumption that the relationship is linear. You could have an admixture-based relationship where it was not exactly linear. So, for instance, having 80% East Asian or more admixture might cause not a proportional, but greater than or less than proportional effect on entrepreneurship or sleep depth or any feature.
But
So we
what
looked at
story?
the
Sorry.
yes.
What were the traits that were being measured in this paper? Because you used the word neuropsychological.
Oh, that it was just that particular paper. That paper was partly what's called a methodology paper, because
Okay.
as an econometrician, a lot of my work doing factor analysis has been kind of pushing the statistical techniques rather than the empirical estimates. So in econometrics, as well as in psychometrics, and in many fields, quantitative fields that use statistics, you can do a paper which is mostly about the data and understanding the particular data, or you can do a paper that's mostly about the statistical technique. What method should you use to analyze the data? Now, that was, I'm not sure how many of your readers will be interested, but that paper was mostly about the methodology.
Yes,
In other
that's
words,
why it
what are
was
the
so
differences?
complicated.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. But the data we used was really just G factor score data. We didn't go beyond G factor score data. There has been some work, but it's really kind of died a little bit. And I think because it's censored about entrepreneurship. And I was interested in your
Well,
article
I
on
like well,
entrepreneurship.
we're going to elaborate on that discussion. I like Shane Scott. So there's a researcher called Shane Scott. He has written on the genetics of entrepreneurship. There's also another researcher, a non-Western researcher, who did a study on the relationship between the ability to consume lactase and entrepreneurship. And
Oh, really?
his findings are super interesting. I
Yeah.
want to interview him because the study is so explosive. I am going to look for it now. I've been unable to retrieve the name mentally, so
Very
let me look it up
interesting.
immediately.
Yeah,
But
very
it's a
interesting.
brilliant study.
Yeah, and see, this is what's being blanked out. So we're losing this stuff because we're not allowing people to analyze it. But yes, these second order effects, the non-G factor effects, could easily be explored by admixture. But it's hard to do now because it's admixture of any kind of behavioral trait. It still can be used for medical traits, but admixture of behavioral traits has been really pushed out of the acceptable range of uh, supported research. So it's hard to
Yes,
get funding. It's hard to get
the
access.
researcher name is Boubacar Diallo, and the paper is Entrepreneurship and Genetics: New Evidence. And let me briefly read the abstract. Using several measures of entrepreneurship, as well as regional and panel data of countries, it finds that lactase persistence has a significant impact on entrepreneurship. Moreover, it shows that cross-country level variation in the frequency of lactase persistence found in the body more than 500 years ago explains these observed differences across countries and regions today. Specifically, it finds that a one standard deviation increase in lactase persistence decreases regional self-employment by 7%. In addition, the estimates show that a one standard deviation increase in lactase persistence decreases total early stage entrepreneurial activity and established business ownership by 4% and 1.58% respectively. What I am interested in, however, is the link between lactase tolerance and opportunity versus necessity driven entrepreneurship. So people in this ecology, are they likely to be innovative entrepreneurs or are they likely to be hustlers? Because opportunity driven entrepreneurship enables innovation and employment growth. Self-employment is not a measure of entrepreneurship because an entrepreneur is innovative. So I would love to see a study examining the link between
Yeah.
lactase tolerance and opportunity-driven entrepreneurship.
Yes, and what you want to do there, see, lactase persistence would be unusual. A feature like entrepreneurship would be very highly polygenic, as it's called. What highly polygenic means is, as I mentioned, you have 2.9 billion base pairs, and highly polygenic means a feature. Say you have two children, and one is very entrepreneurial, and one is very staid and non-entrepreneurial. That'd be very common in a family. If you then gave them each a you measured the genome of each, okay, and then compared them, you'd find that the entrepreneurial genes, okay, as they're called, they're really alleles, but the genes, there might be, say, 500,000, even 1,000,000 different base pairs that feed into what you call entrepreneurship. That's what's called highly polygenic. It's hard to identify them. That's why admixture regression is used in many cases, but it's hard to identify the individual base pairs. Statistically, that's a very difficult problem. But when you do make an attempt, it's called a polygenic index. You basically have a set of coefficients, which for each of the million, say you might have 1,000,000 individual genes that you're using for tagging. For each of them, you assign them how much they contribute to entrepreneurship. Now, for lactase tolerance, that is not so polygenic. That is probably less polygenic. In other words, that depends on a smaller number. It might be, a few thousand base pairs that feed into that, or maybe 10,000. So a smaller number of base pairs. So it's a little bit, it would have a simpler polygenic index. But what you're talking about there statistically, Lipton, in you're linking those two, you're kind of linking their polygenic indices, that they share base pairs. They share commonality in what base pairs they depend upon. That's at the genetic level. How you do that research, obviously the paper, which I haven't read that you're talking about, is doing at the level of the trait. They're looking at lactose tolerance or is it lactase tolerance?
Lactase persistence, yes.
Lactase tolerance and entrepreneurship at the trait level. They're not looking at the polygenic index level, but you could look at it at the polygenic index level.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the interesting work is at that level now.
Yeah, this study is important. Some of its findings appear contradictory because it does argue. It finds that a 1 standard deviation increase in lactase persistence decreases regional self-employment. And then it says the estimates show that a 1 standard deviation increase in lactase persistence decreases total early stage entrepreneurial activity and established business ownership by 4% and 1.58%. Okay. So I already some years ago. So an increase in lactase persistence decreases regional self-employment, and estimate shows that a 1 standard deviation increase decreases total early stage entrepreneurial activity. Yes. Now let me tell you the conflict that I was experiencing based on research that I have read. Lactase persistence is correlated with development. So one person argues that Europeans inherited a physiological advantage because of this ability. However, as Scott Shane said, high rates of entrepreneurship are indicative of economic backwardness. So I'm wondering that if countries with the ability to digest this trait are likely to be more innovative and productive, and as such, entrepreneurship rates are lower. So entrepreneurship is positive, but if in a country 95% of people are self-employed, it obviously means that the economy is not functioning properly. That's why they resort to self-employment to evade poverty, like in Jamaica. That's what the GEM study showed for Jamaica.
Sure. Yeah, because
I'm wondering if the richer countries have a lower level of self-employment because they're more developed and they inherited that physiological advantage.
Yes. Yeah, because the corporate structure is an advanced structure, whereas the self-employment structure, as you know, economically is a more primitive structure. So self-employment, although it's a sign of entrepreneurship, is not a sign of development.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's what Scott Shane said.
And the lactase, well, you have to be careful how this is phrased, and because I don't work in this area.
Neither of us do. It's just an assumption.
Yeah, because it's milk. It's basically cultures which developed milk technology, the ability to draw milk from cattle and goats, had an advantage. And that was developed in several different areas, as I understand it, independently. And so the actual genetic signals are not identical in terms of because the kind of the baseline, okay, the baseline was not, you're not able to absorb milk after you come out of infancy. It was really an innovation in the genome which allowed milk to be absorbed post infancy. And that was associated with culture, with goats and cattle being milked. So I don't see any direct link, and obviously that is going to give you more nutrients.
Yes,
It's going
but
to
the
contribute.
physiological origins of economic growth, people have been studying that topic more extensively. So
Oh
that's
yes.
why I'm giving
Oh
credence
yes.
to the idea.
And you also see it in diseases. I mean, again, well, this does come into economics, but you do see it in diseases as well, because when the agricultural, you mentioned you've studied history, the agricultural revolutions also led to a whole new range of diseases. So that, in fact, what wiped out the New World Amerindians more than anything was that the Europeans had agriculture. With that, they developed a whole host of new diseases, and then a whole host of new protections against those diseases in their genome. Not perfect protection, but protections. And then when they went to the New World, they brought the diseases to which they were mostly protected by their genomic structure, and the Amerindians were not protected. It led to, as you know, I guess, if you looked at North American history, that led to a devastating plague of epidemics among the Native Americans, in fact. So culture brings changes to the genome, certainly.
Let
And
me
lactose
read
tolerance is one of them.
this
Yeah.
important point from your article. Facing Reality. Cooper, Kuiper et al. Cooper, so he
Yes.
published an important paper. Let me read an extract. The strong increase in social complexity resulting from the Neolithic Revolution and the process of urbanization and occupational specialization are likely factors that could have driven the evolutionary advantage of improved intelligence-related scores.
Yes. And I should point out that this is discussed probably in an even better job, but this is something that Charles Murray also discusses in his book, Human Diversity. But as he mentions, and as I mention, I hope this is at the frontier. And this is the frontier we're missing by not allowing scientific progress in this area.
Yes.
But what we're looking at here is, as different societies developed, it actually feeds into the genome, just like lactose tolerance does. Okay, and smallpox tolerance, that comes out of culture. You develop an agricultural society, and from that, it feeds back into your genome because it affects who survives and who has children. Okay, what Cooper et al. Find is that if you look at the European history, what happened in Europe is you developed quite a sophisticated civilization, agricultural civilization in Europe, and that affected who survived and prospered, and that fed into cognitive traits. There's also interesting evidence. This is again very much at the frontier, and this is not known, but it's suspected. If you look at rice-based cultures in Japan and China and India, they actually developed a slightly different range of cognitive traits from, say, European cultures or African cultures, having to do with when you have a rice-based culture, conformity is very important.
That's actually quite developed research.
Yeah, and group activity is quite important. because the rice farming requires it's a cooperative farming methodology. So now that's what Cooper is new work based on Reich's database, and what they're looking at pure, they're actually using G-factor score polygenic indices. And what they're tracing is, you can see in the record, if you look at, you dig up skeletons from different periods, and the Reich Laboratory at Harvard now has a substantial database of European ancestry skeleton DNA going back for 5,000 or 10,000 years. And if you compare the DNA samples, you can measure that there's been an improvement in cognitive scores in Europe over the last 5,000 years. So that's a very interesting finding, that in fact, it doesn't take tens of thousands of years to see measurable differences in cognitive ability scores in the human genome. It's only, it only requires a few thousand years to see real differences. So yeah, that's a frontier that hasn't been properly explored yet, but that's very new. And we're talking, again, Charles Murray does a good job of this, but we're talking very speculatively there, but we know something's going on.
Yeah, it's conjecture. So this will be our I'm going to send you another link, which will be our final link, because we have to talk about entrepreneurship.
Okay.
All right.